What I want to talk about today is your scapula and scapular movement. Now, if you've ever been bench pressing and someone has said something like, try pinching back your shoulder blades, or you've been doing pull-ups and people say, really pull down before you initiate the pulling movement, they're talking about your scapula. Other common cues like pack your shoulders is what retraction and depression of the scapula is. So I figured this is a good opportunity to talk about what is your scapula, what does it do, and what are some ways that we can incorporate it into our training as movement primers or as ways to train itself. So let's start with how the scapula moves, kind of what it does. Your scapula pulls your shoulder blades in back or forward, which is retraction and protraction, or elevation and depression, which is raising and lowering. So that's protraction, retraction, elevation, and depression. When people are talking about packing your shoulders for the bench press, that incorporates retraction and depression of the scapula, essentially pulling them back and down to create a very stable base for pressing. Now, if we're using scapular movements to warm up for bench press, a really good closed chain way to do this is in a push-up position, where we can just get into a push-up position, and without bending at the elbows, we're simply pulling back the shoulder blades and then pushing them out as far as possible. So we're pinching back the shoulder blades and then pushing them out. What a closed chain exercise means is that your body is what's moving. There's not an external implement. So a bench press itself would be an external open chain movement, whereas a push-up against the ground is closed chain. Typically in recovery, you do closed chain exercises, and so it really transitions nice for warm-ups. Now, let's say if you wanted to be a little more specific and you were incline bench pressing that day, you could also go ahead and just do the same exact movement at a different incline angle. And so we're still able to retract and protract throughout the movement. Now, personally, one of my favorite things to do for warm-ups for individuals is hanging scapular raises. And so we're going through the same exact thing, but more so focused on elevation and depression of the scapula. So if we start hanging here, I'm in a complete dead hang all the way to the bottom. Without bending my elbows, I can pull up and lower back down. And this can be a great way to help cueing pull-ups, where you first retract the scapula before going into the actual pull-up motion. So if you look from the back, you can see I'm fully in a dead hang. I retract the scapula before initiating the pull-up, and then all the way down to the bottom. This can be a really helpful way to engage more of your back while doing these movements. One of my favorite things about this overall, though, is it doesn't have to be so cut and dry linear motions in any given direction. So many times with training, we think about just solid planes of moving, horizontal, vertical, even something like an incline press. It's always at set angles. I'm a big fan of starting to load these scapular movements through the range of motion. So maybe holding dumbbells at your side and going forward, up, back, and down, actually loading the movement. On the ground, this looks like this. I'm in the push-up position. I can come forward, retract, depress, protract, and reverse the circle as well. You can even do this in a forearm plank positioning. And then finally, also in the hanging position, where we allow ourselves to come forward, elevate, back, and down. By loading through this range of motion, it's more applicable to things outside of just weight training. If your goal is to be safer and build up a bigger bench press, you can stick to the closed chain, just forward and back movement. But if your goal is to build a more readily available athletic body, you might want to think about ultimately transitioning to scapular movements instead of just these set planes. Let me know what you think. I hope you learned something, and happy training.